A widow was raising 4 children in a broken wagon on the side of a Colorado road. The rear axle was split clean through. I could see that from 30 yards out, even in the failing light. I'd been meaning to ride past. The day had already gone long, and the sky was doing what Colorado skies do in October, pulling the warmth out of things fast, the blue going to gray, going to nothing. And I had 11 head to move before dark and no help to move them with. My operation wasn't much. 20 acres of thin grass west of Pueblo, a barn that needed its south wall repacked with new sod before the freeze came in, and a mule named Cicero who had opinions about everything and no reluctance sharing them. That was the sum of it. I didn't need complications. But the wagon sat at a tilt on the shoulder of the road, and there were children's voices coming from inside it. I pulled up. She was on her knees in the dirt beside the broken wheel, her hands wrapped around the axle housing like she could hold it together by force. Dark hair pinned up but half fallen across the side of her face. A dress that had been blue once and was now the color of road dust. She looked up when she heard my horse, and her expression didn't change much. Not frightened, not relieved, just watching the way a woman watches when she's had reason to calibrate her expectations of strange men. I got down. The wagon was loaded, a family's worth of things wrapped in canvas and tied with rope, some of it hanging loose where the tilt of the axle had let things shift. 4 faces appeared at the canvas flap. The oldest was a girl, maybe 8, with her mother's eyes and a composure that didn't belong on a child that age. The youngest was a boy young enough that he was still unsteady on his feet, clutching the canvas edge with both fists and looking at me with the pure, uncomplicated interest children have before they learn that strangers are a category requiring caution. I crouched down and looked at the axle housing. The crack ran through the main shaft, not just the casing. It wasn't a field repair. I said the axle was done. She said she knew. She said it without heat, the way someone says a thing they've already made peace with. I asked where she was headed, and she said Bent Creek. Her husband's sister had a place there. She said it the way people say the name of a place when they're holding on to it, like the word itself is load-bearing. I asked where her husband was. She looked at the dirt between her hands, then looked back up at me. She said he'd died in August. A fever 6 days start to finish. She said it plain, without flinching, and I understood from the way she said it that she'd had to say it to enough people by now that the words no longer broke her. They just cost her something each time, a small withdrawal, and she was getting careful about the balance. My name is Hale Dempsey. I told her so. She said hers was Clara Renner. I stood and looked up the road and then back the way I'd come. The nearest settlement with a smithy was Harlow's Crossing, 14 miles south. Bent Creek was another 30 miles north. The sun had maybe 2 hours left. The temperature would drop hard once it went, and there was a particular smell to the air that afternoon, something damp and metallic underneath the cold, that said the season's first real frost was coming in the night. I told her all of that. I told her my place was 2 miles east on the Abilene Creek track. I said she was welcome to shelter for the night, that I had a barn with room enough, and that in the morning I'd ride south to Harlow's Crossing and get what was needed for the axle. She didn't say anything for a moment. She was calculating something. I could see her doing it, going through the options the way a woman does when she's been managing alone long enough that she doesn't assume anyone's offer is uncomplicated. She looked at the 4 faces in the canvas. She looked at the sky. She looked at me. She said, "All right." I don't know what I expected from myself in those first hours. I'd been alone on that land for going on 2 years. Before that, I'd done things I didn't want to think about, work that paid well and left marks on a man that don't show to other people, but that he feels in specific ways, in how he wakes up sometimes, in what he notices when he walks into a room. I'd taken contracts down in New Mexico territory, worked for a land combine that was legal enough on paper if you didn't read past the surface, and I'd told myself it was lawful enough because I needed the money, and because telling yourself things is easier than not telling yourself things. I was done with all of that. I'd bought the 20 acres and the mule and the cattle, and I was trying to be a man who grew things instead of ending them. Most days I thought I was pulling it off. What I did not expect was that having 4 children in my barn and a woman sleeping in my house, in my own bed, me on the porch wrapped in a saddle blanket and my coat, would feel less like a burden and more like something I'd been missing for so long I'd forgotten it had a shape. We moved the wagon by unhitching the horses, a matched pair of grays, good animals, tired and hungry, and leaving the wagon box where it sat with its axle problem. I tied the grays to the back of my saddle, and we walked the 2 miles in, Clara carrying Thomas and leading the older 3. The oldest girl's name was me. She was 8 and had appointed herself responsible for her siblings the way oldest children do when a father goes missing, gravely, without being asked, carrying the weight of it up in her shoulders and in the set of her mouth. She walked beside her mother and held Ida's hand without being told to. The next was a boy named Daniel who was 6 and had decided within 40 minutes of arrival that Cicero was the finest creature he'd ever encountered. He stood at the fence with his arms through the rails and talked to the mule in a low, confiding voice, and Cicero stood at the other side and regarded him with large, philosophical eyes. The third was Ida, who was 4 and mostly silent, watching everything with enormous brown eyes that missed nothing. And Thomas, the youngest, who was 2.5 and had not yet learned that strangers weren't automatically friendly, which was a piece of knowledge I was glad he hadn't acquired yet. Thomas decided I was friendly. He followed me out of the barn when I went to bring water and grabbed the hem of my coat and walked with me, his short legs working hard over the uneven ground between the well and the barn door, holding on with both fists. I haven't thought about that in a long time without something happening in my chest. Clara Renner cooked supper from her own provisions, wouldn't touch mine, wouldn't hear of it. I laid the fire and she arranged herself in the kitchen as though she'd spent enough time in working kitchens that finding what she needed was a matter of looking with a practical eye. She found the skillet on its hook and the flint in the tin by the stove and the lamp without asking twice. She'd brought cornmeal and salt pork and dried beans enough for 3 days if they were careful, and she made a meal from them that was better than anything I'd put together in those 2 years of living alone. The children sat at my table and ate. I ate with them. I couldn't tell you the last time someone had sat at that table with me. Probably 2 years back, probably the man I'd bought the land from, who'd stayed one night to sign over the deed and left at first light. Supper was a thing with noise in it. Daniel asked me 6 questions about Cicero. Ida ate methodically and watched me from beneath her hair. Me poured water for everyone before sitting herself, including for me, setting the cup down at my elbow without comment. Thomas ate with focused dedication and had salt pork on both cheeks by the end of it and couldn't have been more pleased with himself. After the children were down in the barn, me and Daniel bedded in the hay, Ida and Thomas in the wagon bed, which I'd rolled inside out of the wind on a set of blocks. I sat with Clara by the fire, and she asked me directly what I'd done before I'd come here. I told her I'd done some hired work I wasn't proud of. She said she'd figured as much. She said I moved like a man who'd been careful for a long time about where he put his hands, and that careful moving men either learned it from a trade that required precision or from something else. I said that was a hell of an observation. She said she'd had to get good at reading men. 6 years in freight country with a husband who employed hired hands, you got a feel. I asked if she was afraid of me. She looked at the fire for a moment, then at me. She said no. She said the men she'd been afraid of had never looked her in the eye the way I did. That afraid men and cruel men both looked somewhere past you, or at a part of you, but not at you. She said I looked at her. I didn't have an answer for that. I put more wood on the fire and we sat. She told me about her husband. Arthur Renner had run a small freight operation out of Trinidad, 3 wagons, hired drivers, contracts with 2 mining companies and a trading post. A decent man. Not a remarkable man, she said, but decent, which she'd come to understand was rare enough that decent was worth more than people gave it credit for. He'd died in 6 days from a fever that came on hard and turned fast. She'd buried him herself because the nearest neighbor was 5 miles out, and the men she'd tried to send for hadn't come in time. And she didn't talk about that part except to say it once, quietly looking at the floor, and then she moved on. She'd sold the freight wagons and the teams to pay what they owed. The business's debts were bigger than she'd known. Arthur had been managing that quietly, protecting her from it, which she understood now was a kind of love but which had left her with nothing but the family wagon and a little money and 4 children to move to Bent Creek, where the sister-in-law had written her a letter saying, "Come." I asked what she'd do at the sister-in-law's. She said she'd work. She was good with a household, she said. She could cook for hired hands, keep ledgers, manage accounts. She said it the way a woman says things when she's already given herself the speech about her own capabilities, going through them deliberately, making sure they're still standing. I said she'd be fine. She looked at me sideways. She said most men didn't say things like that to a widow with 4 children and an axle problem sitting on the side of a Colorado road. I said I wasn't most men. She looked at the fire, then back at me. She said, "No, I don't think you are." I rode to Harlow's Crossing in the gray before dawn. The frost had come in exactly the way the air had promised. A hard one, the ground iron under the horses' hooves, the grass standing white and stiff along the creek. Cicero had opinions about the hour and about the cold, but he went, which was more than could be said for some mornings. The smithy at Harlow's Crossing was run by a man named Obadiah Ferris, who was ornery at the best of times, and at 5 in the morning was something elevated. I told him what I needed and described the crack, and he told me what it would cost. I paid it without argument because arguing with Ferris added 2 hours to any transaction, and I waited in the cold outside his forge while he worked, stamping my feet and watching the light come up over the eastern plain. While I waited, I bought flour, 2 pounds of dried apple, and a tin of molasses from the settlement's one store, which was run by a woman named Greaves who opened at 6 regardless of weather, and who asked me no questions, which I appreciated. The axle housing took most of the morning. Ferris was meticulous even when ornery, which is the kind of smith you want when you're counting on a piece of iron. The fit was right when he was done. I strapped it across my saddle bags and rode back north. When I got back, Clara had my barn swept. Not tidied, swept with the broom from behind the barn door that I used twice a year, if that. The floor was clean. The tools were hung back where they belonged. She'd found the loose board on the east wall and wedged a piece of scrap timber under it to brace it. She'd found a broken harness ring hanging useless on a peg and set it on the workbench with a note beside it in a clear hand. "This wants fixing." The children were washed. Daniel had found an old bridle hanging on a post, not the good one, the dry one I'd been meaning to treat for a year, and had oiled it, working at the stiff leather with a piece of rag and a tin of saddle oil he'd found without being asked, moving along the straps methodically, the way a boy works when he's concentrating. I don't know why that hit me the way it did. He was 6 years old. He'd just found a thing that needed doing and done it. The axle work took most of the afternoon. Ferris had shaped it right and it fit clean. I'd worked on enough wagon rigs over the years to know what I was doing. Me held the bolts in order without being told, passing them to me when I needed them, anticipating which size before I reached. She didn't drop one. Clara worked beside me for 2 hours, her hands in it, no complaint about the grease or the cold. At one point the housing slipped and I caught it, and her hand was under mine for a second. She'd reached for the same thing, and she left it there a beat before pulling back, not hurried, not self-conscious, just natural. We got the wagon sound before dark. I rolled it back out and hitched the grays and checked the wheels and the tongue and the rigging. Everything held. Clara stood beside me while I checked it, and she didn't hover or ask questions. She just watched, and when I was done she ran her own hand along the new housing and nodded once. She thanked me at supper, said it directly, looking at me across the table in front of all 4 children. Said, "Hale, you didn't have to do any of this and you did it anyway, and I want you to know I see that." I said it was nothing. She said it wasn't nothing. The children looked between us. Thomas had a spoon in each hand and was considering them with great seriousness, one then the other, as though they presented a philosophical problem. I didn't say anything else. I didn't know what to say. There's a thing that happens when someone looks at you and names what you've done, not just the thank you, but the naming of the fact of it, the acknowledgement that they saw you doing it and they know what it cost you, even if what it cost you was only a day and some money and a night on a porch. It goes somewhere unexpected. I'd been thanked for things before. I'd been paid for things before. This was neither of those. After they were down again, I sat by the dying fire and thought about it for a while. I thought about the years in New Mexico. The work I didn't name anymore, even to myself if I could help it. I'd come to this land and these animals and this quiet life because I needed to find out if the sum of a man could be recalculated, if you could add enough to the right side of an equation to change what it balanced to. I'd been doing the work for 2 years. I didn't know if it was working. You don't know most days if it's working. You just keep adding. But Clara Renner had looked at me in front of her 4 children and said, "I see that." That meant something about the adding. They left the next morning early, a little after dawn, the frost still on the ground and the sky pale and enormous above the plain. All 4 children came to say goodbye to me. Me shook my hand like a small adult. her grip serious and complete. Daniel hugged Cicero around the nose, and the mule bore it with the dignified patience of a creature who had accepted certain things about the world. Ida stood in front of me and held her arms up, and I picked her up, and she put her face against my collar and held on for a moment, both arms around my neck, her small weight real and warm, and then let go in the matter-of-fact way of children who have learned not to hold on too long. Thomas said, "Bye, horseman." He'd been calling me horseman since the first morning, when he'd woken up before the others and found me in the yard with Cicero, and the name had apparently resolved something in his mind about who I was and what I was for. Clara stood by the wagon seat. She'd repinned her hair. She had her provisions arranged, and the children boarded, and the reins in her hands, and she looked like a woman who was going to get where she was going, who had always been going to get where she was going, who just needed the road to cooperate. She said, "If you ever pass through Bent Creek." I said, "I'll look in on you." She held my eyes for a moment, then she said, "See that you do." She put the wagon in motion. She didn't look back. I stood in the road and watched until the wagon went around the bend by the cottonwoods and the sound of the wheels on the frozen ground faded out. Then I went back to work. That first day after they left, I moved the 11 head to the east pasture, where the grass was still holding under the frost. Cold work moving cattle in October, the ground slick in the low spots and the animals contrary about leaving the water they knew. Cicero and I worked it out between us over 4 hours. When we were done, I came back and started on the south wall of the barn, pulling the old sod out where it had gone dry and crumbly and packing new sections in from the pile I'd cut in September. Hard physical work, the kind that empties a man's head. It didn't empty mine. I kept thinking about Daniel's old bridle. It was hanging in the place of the dry one now, dark and supple, the leather smelling the way good-treated leather smells. The boy had done a thorough job. He'd gone along each strap in order and worked the oil in with a rag and gone back over the spots that hadn't taken it the first time. He was 6 years old. I kept thinking about me passing me bolts in the right order, about Ida holding on for that moment before letting go, about Thomas and the spoons. I kept thinking about Clara's hand under mine when the housing slipped. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes on a man past 50 that isn't like younger loneliness. When you're young and alone, it has urgency to it, a hunger. When you're older, it's more like a weather, a climate you've adapted to. You stop noticing it the way you stop noticing the particular smell of your own house. It's just the condition things are in, the default state of the days. You organize your life around it without meaning to. You make the coffee for one. You set one place. You don't bother lighting the lamp until the dark is too dark to work in, because what difference does another hour of light make when there's no one to spend it with? I'd been in that climate for 2 years, probably longer if I was honest with myself. Probably since before I'd left New Mexico, since the work down there had made me the kind of man who kept his distance from people, because keeping your distance from people is easier when your work requires that you sometimes make very final decisions about them. 3 days had changed the climate. Not fixed it, not solved it, just reminded me it wasn't permanent. On the second day, I finished the south wall and started pulling the weak boards from the barn floor in the corner where water came in when the snow melted. I replaced them with new timber I'd been storing since summer, fitting each board and pegging it and moving to the next. Good steady work. The kind that shows you something at the end of it. When I was done, that corner of the floor was solid enough to last another 10 years. I made a list that evening of what the operation needed for winter. Hay for the horses and Cicero, I had enough cut but would need to buy another 50 bales from the Hennessy outfit 2 miles south if the winter ran long. Feed grain, coal oil for the lamps, 2 new ropes. The south window in the house had a frame that was going soft and needed replacing before the real cold came. There were a dozen smaller things. The numbers came up short. Not badly, I'd had worse years, but short enough that the winter would require care. I went over it twice to make sure I had the arithmetic right. Then I put the list away. I thought about Bent Creek for a long time before I blew out the lamp. I'd said I'd look in on them, and I'd meant it, but meaning a thing and doing a thing are different countries. 30 miles north on a road that would be snowed in by December. A widow with 4 children who had her own situation to manage, her own plans, her own life to arrange, and didn't need a former hired gun from down south complicating it. She'd said, "See that you do," and she'd meant it in some sense, but a woman says see that you do at the end of something and means come back if you want to. if it makes sense, if things work out. She doesn't mean be on my doorstep in a week with your hat in your hand. I thought about that. I see that. On the third day, I saddled Cicero before first light. He had extensive opinions about the hour. He communicated them through his ears and through the quality of his attention while I saddled him, which was a pointed inattention, a studied indifference to the buckles and the girth, a suggestion that if I wanted a mule who endorsed this plan, I was going to have to look elsewhere. I finished saddling him, and he stood there and reconsidered the situation, and then blew out a long breath and walked out through the barn door with me, which was as close as Cicero came to agreeing. The road north was empty. The cold was serious. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone bare, and their branches made a fine scratching sound in the wind that had come up from the north. Cicero put his head down against it and walked, and I let him pick his pace because we had 30 miles and the light came up slow in October. I'd ridden harder country than this and in worse seasons. I wasn't thinking about the road. I was thinking about whether I was a man who did what he said he'd do, and about what the answer to that had been in various years, and about whether the answer was different now. We made Bent Creek in the early afternoon, the sun low and cold and throwing long shadows off the buildings. It was a small place, a church with a white-painted spire that needed paint, a general store, a feed barn with its doors open, and the smell of hay coming out warm, 12 or 15 houses in various states of permanence along 2 packed dirt streets. A dog came out from somewhere and followed Cicero for half a block, and then lost interest. I tied Cicero at the rail in front of the general store and went in. A man behind the counter, maybe 60, with a careful look about him. I asked if he knew where a widow named Renner had come to stay. Said she'd arrived in the last few days at a relative's place. He said the Holt house, sister-in-law, second house east of the church on the south side. I found it, a low house with a good roof. Someone had put careful work into that roof, and a kitchen garden to the south side that had been tended with real thought, the beds winterized and mulched, a cold frame over the late greens. A lamp was already lit in the front window even though it wasn't full dark. The light was warm and yellow in the pale afternoon. I tied Cicero to the post and knocked. Me opened the door. She looked up at me and went absolutely still for a moment, just looked, taking me in, and then she turned her head back into the house and called in a voice that was trying to stay calm. Mama. It's Horse Man's friend. I heard Clara before I saw her, her steps in the hallway. A pause. Then she was in the doorway, drying her hands on an apron she'd tied on over her dress, and she looked at me and something in her face settled. Something that had been held a particular way settled into a different position, like a joint that had been slightly wrong clicking back into place. She said, I wondered if you'd come. I said I would. She looked at me for another moment, then she stepped back and held the door open. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and it smelled like a house that had people in it, which is a smell that's easier to notice when you've been without it for a long time. Thomas was on the floor building something complicated and structural from sticks and a tin cup. He looked up at me, ran a quick assessment, and said, Horse Man. I said, that's me. Daniel was at the table with a length of rope he was working at trying to knot, his tongue between his teeth, a boy entirely absorbed in a problem. He looked up when I came in and grinned at me the way children grin when something confirms a theory they had. Ida was asleep in a chair by the stove with her knees pulled up, her hair loose, her face peaceful. Me went back to what she'd been doing before I knocked, which appeared to be sorting a basket of winter squash by size on the kitchen counter. She worked without looking at me, but her shoulders were easier than they'd been when she'd opened the door, the particular easiness of a person who's been holding a small worry and has just been relieved of it. Clara poured coffee without asking and set it in front of me and sat across the table from me, and we talked. Not about much. About the road and the weather and how the cattle were going to do in the cold, and whether I thought Ferris at the smithy was going to stay reliable or whether his ornery was going to get ahead of his skill one of these years. She asked about the south wall of the barn. I told her it was done, solid enough to last. She asked about Cicero's opinions on the morning's ride. I told her they had been extensive and detailed and largely negative, but that he'd come around. She smiled. She had a smile that didn't perform itself. It just happened, a small true thing. Daniel asked if he could go see Cicero at the rail, and Clara said wait for dark to come in, and then yes, and Daniel went back to his knots. The sister-in-law, who I understood to be named Ruth Holt, came through the kitchen briefly. A solid woman in her 50s, practical-looking, who gave me a measuring look, and then gave Clara a separate look, and then said she was going next door to Marjorie's for the evening, which I understood was a thing she had decided at this particular moment for reasons that were about reading a situation correctly. We ate supper, the 5 of us plus the empty chair where Ruth had been. Clara had cooked. It was good. The children were warm and fed and easy in the way children are when they have landed somewhere after travel, when the ground has stopped moving under them. Thomas got molasses on his shirt and his chin and both hands and couldn't have been more satisfied with his evening. Ida woke up from her chair before supper was done and came and leaned against my arm at the table without asking. Just leaned there, warm and heavy, and went back to sleep leaning. I sat very still for a while so I wouldn't disturb her. The children went to bed one at a time. Ida was carried by Clara, still asleep. Thomas got down from his chair and came and stood in front of me and said, "Night, horseman," and held his arms up, and I lifted him and held him for a moment and put him down, and he went. Daniel shook my hand at the doorway the same way me had on the road, that same grave small adult handshake, and then went. Me stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at me and then at her mother and then at me again, and then she said, "I'm glad you came back, Mr. Dempsey." She said it like a statement of considered opinion, and then went to bed. Clara and I sat by the stove after. The house was quiet. The fire ticked. Cicero was ashape at the post in the dark outside the window, patient as always, his breath showing when the wind moved the lamplight out that far. Clara said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me straight." I said, "All right." She said, "Are you a man who's trying to be something better than what he was?" I looked at her. I thought about various answers, and all of them felt like less than the question deserved. I said yes. She nodded, not quickly, the nod of someone accepting something into a place they'd made ready for it. She looked at the stove. Then she looked back at me. She said, "Then I don't need to know the rest of it." I sat with that. The fire ticked. Out at the rail, Cicero shifted his weight, and the sound came through, that small restlessness I knew as well as I knew my own breathing. Clara leaned forward and put her hand over mine where it rested on the table. She didn't squeeze it or make anything of it, just put it there, steady, warm, the flat of her palm over the back of my hand, and she left it there and looked at me. She said, "You're a good man, Hale Dempsey." I have had people say things to me over the years that I have held on to. A small number of them specific. My mother, when I was young, telling me something about my father that she'd wanted me to know while there was still time to know it. One man in Kansas, a man I'd worked beside who knew what I'd come from, knew what the years looked like from the outside, and had said, "It doesn't have to be what you go toward. I hold those things in a specific place, not in my chest, not in my head. Somewhere between, in the place where a man keeps what he actually believes about himself when he's being honest." This went in that place. I turned my hand over under hers. She let me. We sat like that until the fire burned low and the lamp guttered and needed oil, and neither of us moved to fix it right away. She said after a while, "The road from your place, how long does it take in good weather?" I said 3 hours, less if Cicero was cooperating, which was not guaranteed. She said, "And in spring when the snow's off?" I said, "Same, road's good." She looked at me and I looked at her, and we let that sit there between us. The way you let a thing sit when you both know what it means, and there's no need to make it into more words than it is. I rode back south the next morning. I had 11 head to move and a window frame going soft and a barn wall that needed the second sod pack before the freeze came in, and the animals didn't care about any of the things that had happened in the last 3 days. They just needed tending. That's what animals are good for. In a way, they keep you practical when your mind is going somewhere it's never been. Clara stood in the doorway when I untied Cicero. The sun was barely up. The frost was back, the yard stiff and white, the grass holding the cold in its blades. She had her arms crossed against the morning chill, and her hair was still half down, the way it had been when we'd first met on the road. And she looked at me the way she'd looked at me across the table the night before, directly. With that clarity I'd come to understand was just how she looked at things she'd decided about. Daniel appeared at her shoulder and raised his hand at me. I raised mine back. Then me was there too, me who had shaken my hand at the road 3 days ago and shaken it again last night at the bedroom door. She looked at me and looked at her mother and then back at me, and she didn't say anything, which was her way of saying something. Clara put her hand up flat, not a wave, just a held hand, a held moment, palm toward me. I held mine up back. Then I turned Cicero south on the road. He moved out easy in the cold morning air, his breath showing in small, quick puffs. The sky was going from gray to the kind of pale blue that comes in before the real blue, the tentative light, and the cottonwoods along the creek threw long, thin shadows across the road ahead of me. I sat back in the saddle and let him find his stride. I'd been thinking on the ride up about what Clara had asked me, whether I was a man who was trying to be something better than what he was. I'd answered yes because it was the honest answer, but riding south now I thought about it differently, not as a question of whether I was trying, but whether it was working, whether the adding was taking. You don't know from inside the trying whether you're getting anywhere. You keep doing the work, you fix the wall, you move the cattle. You patch what's broken and tend what's growing and do the next reasonable thing, and then the next one, and some days you can feel the weight of what you were before you started, and some days you can't, and neither one of those days tells you what the sum is. Clara Renner had said, I see that. Me Renner, 8 years old, had said, I'm glad you came back, Mr. Dempsey. Thomas had said, Night horseman, with the same easy certainty he used for everything. As though I were a fixed thing in the world, as though I'd always been there and always would be. I thought about that for a long time. A man gets to the far side of 50, and the world starts talking him down in ways that are hard to name clearly. Not any one voice, not anything you can answer back, just a general drift. The way rooms don't arrange themselves around you the way they used to. The way certain conversations end just before you get there, or begin after you've left. The way your own opinion of yourself gets thin in the winters when there's nothing to show it to, nothing to test it against. Just the same land and the same cold, and the same walls with no one inside them to confirm you're still what you thought you were. I'd been getting thin. I could see that now from the outside of it, having been briefly outside of it. 2 years of the quiet work, the honest life, the trying, and alone, so the arithmetic had no second set of eyes on it. You need someone to look at you and see what's there, or else after a while you stop being certain there's anything to see. The mirror shows your own face, and that's all it can tell you. You need a different kind of witness. Clara Renner had looked at me across a kitchen table and put her hand over mine and said, You're a good man. She'd said it after 3 days of watching me work and move and sit at table with her children. After watching me in the dirt under a wagon axle and in the barn before dawn and on my own porch in October cold. She'd said it because she'd looked at the evidence the way she looked at everything, practically, without sentiment, without need making her generous. And that was what the evidence told her. That's different from being thanked. That's a woman deciding what you are. I rode home with that. The sun came all the way up while I rode, cold and flat and turning the plain gold on either side of the road. I could see 50 miles of sky in every direction. Colorado sky in October is its own thing. It doesn't give you shade or softness, just magnitude, that enormous blue pressing down on the brown plain and making everything feel exposed and real and permanent. I disliked that about Colorado when I'd first come here. I'd learned to need it. Cicero found his stride. He had a good road-walking pace when he'd committed to a direction, and we covered the miles without hurry. I listened to the sound of his hooves on the packed road and thought about the south wall and the cattle and the window frame and all the work that was waiting, and I thought about the letter I was going to write. By the time I turned onto the Abilene Creek track, the morning was full up. My place looked the same as I'd left it. The cattle had found their way to the water on their own, which was something, and the barn door I'd left half-latched was still half-latched, and the house was quiet and cold and mine. I untied my saddlebags and pulled out the tin of molasses I'd bought at Harlow's Crossing 3 days before. I'd bought it for the children and then not given it to Clara when she left because I was going to ride north anyway and could bring it then, and I'd forgotten it in the bag. I set it on the kitchen shelf. I stood there and looked at it for a moment. Then I went out to move the cattle. Winter came in hard that year and then released in February, a long false thaw, and then came back in March for another month. I got through it. The cattle got through it. Cicero had opinions about every weather change and did not keep them to himself. I replaced the window frame and the hay held and the coal oil lasted, and the things I'd worried about in October turned out to be manageable, the way most things do when you do the work and don't borrow trouble. The window frame was more work than I'd expected. The sill had gone soft all the way through, Water had been getting in at the corner for years, probably since before I'd owned the place, and the rot had moved up into the framing timber in a way I hadn't seen until I pulled the old frame out. I spent 2 days on it, cutting back to sound wood, fitting new timber, resetting the sill. When I was done, the window sat square and the draft was gone, and I could feel the difference in the room from 10 feet away. I found myself wondering if me would have noticed it, were she there to see it. The way she'd noticed things and taken them seriously without being told to. That was a peculiar thing to think, and I noticed I was thinking it. The first snow came in the second week of November and lasted 4 days. Not a burying snow, just a shutting down snow, the kind that silences the road and closes off the distance between you and everything else. I got the cattle into the lower pasture where the windbreak was and put extra hay down and checked on them morning and evening. Cicero moved between the barn and the yard with an air of injured dignity about the whole enterprise. The days were short and the work was interior. Mending tack, sharpening tools, going through the hay supply and doing the arithmetic again, patching the corner of the roof over the back room where a shingle had lifted. I lit the lamp early on those evenings. I'd been in the habit of not doing that, waiting until the dark was too complete to ignore, but I stopped that. I lit the lamp when the light went thin around 4 o'clock and sat with it burning. I don't know exactly why. The lamplight didn't change what was in the room, but it was something. I wrote one letter. I'm not much of a letter writer. I've never had a great deal of confidence in my penmanship or my way of putting things down on paper. But I wrote one, addressed to Clara Renner, care of R. Holt, Bent Creek, Colorado. It wasn't a long letter. I told her the axle had held when I'd gone back for the wagon, which she would have already known but which I wanted to say anyway. I told her the south wall was done and the cattle were in good shape going into winter. I said I hoped they'd arrived and settled well and that the sister-in-law's place was comfortable. I said the molasses was still in the saddlebag, which would not mean anything to her yet, but which made sense to me as something to say. I sealed it and rode it to Harlow's Crossing myself and gave it to the postmaster there, a man named Alcott who ran the mail contract and was reliably discreet. A letter came back 6 weeks later, after Christmas, in a hand that was clear and economical and entirely herself in its tone. She told me they were well. That Ruth Holt had proved to be a practical and fair-minded woman with a good house and more room than she'd expected. That Daniel had already attached himself to the man who ran the feed barn in town, a widower named Calloway, who had apparently tolerated the attachment with some warmth and put him to useful small work. She said Ida was talking more. She said Thomas had told his Aunt Ruth that his friend Horse Man would be coming in spring and that she should make sure there was molasses. I read that letter twice and then set it on the shelf. The winter deepened. The second snow came in January, and this one was serious, 3 feet over 4 days, the kind of snow that redraws the landscape and makes familiar things strange. I lost a cow to it, which is always a hard thing, not because of the cost, though the cost matters, but because an animal in your care is your responsibility. I found her on the 3rd day, frozen in the low place behind the east fence where the snow had drifted. I worked the carcass out of the snow and dressed her and had the meat. That was the practical thing. It didn't make the rest of it easier. I kept working. That's what you do. There are stretches in winter where the work is the only thing that keeps a man's mind in the right direction, and I had enough of it. The hay, the cattle, the ice on the water trough that needed breaking morning and evening, the stove that wanted feeding, the wind that found every gap in the walls and reminded you it was there. In February, the thaw came and then went, which is a particular Colorado cruelty. The road north opened for 2 weeks, and I could have gone and then it closed again. Another hard week of cold and ice. And Cicero stood in the yard and looked at the closed road with an expression that I chose to interpret as sympathetic. March came back cold, as I said, but March ends. I thought about Bent Creek through all of it, not obsessively, not in a way that interfered with the work, just the way a man thinks about something he's already decided, with a kind of patience, with the knowledge that the deciding is done and now it's just a matter of the road cooperating. The road cleared in April. Not all at once. It cleared the way roads clear in Colorado. Patchily, the south-facing stretches going first, the north-facing and the low spots holding ice longer than you'd think reasonable, the whole thing a negotiation between the sun and the ground about who was in charge yet. I went out on foot the first week of April and walked a mile of it, and then turned back and waited 3 more days. On the morning of the 20th, I checked the road again and it was passable. soft in the low spots but passable. I put the tin of molasses in my saddlebag. I found the good bridle, not Daniel's old one, that was on the wall in the barn, but the better one, the silver-mounted one I'd bought in better years and kept clean, and I saddled Cicero with it. He regarded this with interest. He knew the good bridle meant something was different about the day's plans. I rode north. The cottonwoods along the creek were coming in. Small tentative leaves the bright new green that only happens for 2 weeks in April before it deepens, and becomes the summer green. A different color than any other time of year. The road ran alongside the creek for the first 4 miles and then curved away west across the open plain, and the plain was greening in that slow, particular way Colorado plain greens in spring. Not all at once, but in patches. The grass coming back from under the brown in uneven waves, following the moisture, following the slight variations in ground that you can't see, but that the grass knows. There were meadowlarks. There are always meadowlarks in April, and I never get used to them. That sudden clear whistle out of nowhere, out of the flat air. I'd been carrying the winter's quiet for months, and the meadowlarks put something back in the air that the quiet had taken out. Cicero walked into the morning. He knew we were going somewhere, and he'd made his peace with it. He had a good road stride, long and economical, covering ground without hurry. I sat back in the saddle and let him find his rhythm. I thought about what I was doing. Not worrying, I'm past the age of worrying about things I've already decided, but thinking it through. Clara Renner was a woman who had 4 children and a life being rebuilt, and a plan she'd been working toward since August. And I was a man riding north with a tin of molasses and a letter she'd written me in January and the memory of her hand over mine. That was the sum of the evidence. It was either enough or it wasn't, and I wouldn't know until I got there, and getting there was the only way to find out. I wasn't sure what I'd say. I'm not a man who plans speeches. I was going to show up, same as I'd shown up at the house in October, and let what was there be what was there. But I knew what she'd said, see that you do. And I'd said, I'll look in on you. A man says he'll do something, and then he does it. That's the thing in the end. That's most of what being a man comes down to in my experience. Not the large gestures, the small, reliable ones. The doing what you said you'd do, the showing up, the being where you told someone you'd be. I'd been unreliable in some years, and I knew what that cost. I was done with that cost. We had 30 miles, and the road was good, and the day was clear. That was enough to ride on. The white spire of Bent Creek's church came into view around noon. Cicero picked up his pace a little, which meant he could smell town, hay and water and other animals, and had decided to cooperate with the direction things were going. At the rail in front of the Holt house, I tied him, and he stood there and waited. He was good at waiting when there was something in it. I knocked. Me opened the door. She looked up at me. She didn't look surprised exactly. She looked like someone whose theory had been confirmed, which is a different expression, quieter, the expression of someone who had known something would happen and was now in the moment of it happening. She stepped back and opened the door all the way. She said, "Mama," he came back. I heard Clara's steps in the hallway. I was already sure, from the sound of them, the way they moved, unhurried and deliberate, that whatever she was going to look like when she came around the corner was going to be the same thing I'd been carrying through the winter, the same clear-eyed look, the same settled quality. She came around the corner. She looked at me and smiled, not the small contained one, the whole one. She said, "I made coffee." I said, "I brought molasses." She looked at the tin in my hand. She said, "Thomas is going to be beside himself." I went inside. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and it smelled like coffee and wood smoke and children, and the early spring air that was coming in through a window she'd cracked at the top. Not a lot, just enough to let the new air in, a thin line of it, carrying the smell of the greening ground and whatever was blooming by the creek. That combination of warm house and cold outside air is a particular thing. It means someone has made a home warm enough that they can afford to let a little of the outdoors in. Daniel was outside somewhere, his voice audible in the yard, talking to someone, probably the man Calloway from the feed barn, who I'd heard about from Clara's letter. Ida was at the table drawing something careful and detailed with a piece of charcoal on a piece of brown paper. She looked up when I came in and looked back down at her work. Then, after a moment, she looked up again and slid the paper across the table toward me so I could see. She'd drawn a horse and a man. The horse was recognizably Cicero in the way that children's drawings are recognizable, the shape of the thing, the proportion of the ears, something about the stance. The man was tall. I said, "That's a good horse." She said very seriously, "That's you." I pulled out the chair and sat down across from her so I could look at it properly. She watched me looking at it with those enormous careful eyes. Thomas came out of the back hall at a run and stopped when he saw me and said, "Horse man," said it like a declaration, like a bell being rung, and came and grabbed the hem of my coat with both fists and looked up at me. I said, "Hey, Thomas." He said, "I told Aunt Ruth you were coming." I said, "Did she believe you?" He considered this. He said she made cake. Clara was at the stove. She looked at me over her shoulder, and there was something in her face I hadn't seen in October, or hadn't recognized then, a kind of ease, the ease of a person who has been worried about a thing for a while and has now stopped being worried. She turned back to the stove and moved the coffee pot. She said, "It's good that you came." I said, "I know it is." She smiled, the whole one, not the contained one, and said, "Molasses is on the shelf. Thomas has been rationing himself." Thomas said, still attached to my coat, "I have not." Me appeared in the kitchen doorway with a look of forensic interest. She assessed the situation, me at the table, Ida's drawing in front of me, Thomas at my coat, Clara at the stove, and whatever she concluded satisfied her. She went back wherever she'd been. Daniel came in from outside with mud on his boots, talking before he was fully through the door about something Calloway had told him about a horse trade that had gone wrong, and stopped when he saw me and said, "Oh," and then said, "Are you staying?" and looked at his mother. Clara said, "For supper at least." Daniel said, "Good," and went back outside to finish the story with Calloway. We sat in that kitchen through the afternoon, the 5 of us plus Ruth Holt when she came back from her neighbors, who turned out to be a steady, sensible woman who poured herself coffee and asked me 2 direct questions about my cattle operation, and then accepted the answers without further comment. The afternoon light came through the windows and moved across the floor. Ida finished her drawing and started another one. Thomas fell asleep on the floor again, near my boots again, as though my boots were a specific location he'd claimed. There was cake. Ruth had made a good one, walnut, and Thomas woke up for cake. After supper, after the children were down, after Ruth had gone to her room with the tact of a woman who understood when to be elsewhere, Clara and I sat by the stove the way we'd sat in October, and the fire ticked, and Cicero was at the rail outside. She said, "The road from here to your place, what would it take?" I looked at her. She said, "I mean the other direction. 30 miles is 30 miles either way." She was looking at the fire. Then she looked at me, and there was that directness, that clarity, the woman who'd looked at me on a cold road in October and not looked away and not looked past me. I said, "It's good land, thin in places, but it'll carry more cattle than I've been running. The house wants work, the barn's solid." She said, "I can work." I said, "I know that." She said, "4 children." I said, "I know that too." We sat with that, neither of us making it into more words than it was, because it didn't need more words. The question and the answer and the situation all lived in the same few feet of air between us, and we both understood them. She put her hand over mine on the table. She said, "I'll need the spring to settle things here. Get Ruth sorted. Make sure the children are ready for another move." I said, "Spring's young." She said, "Then come back in June." I said, "I'll come back in June." She turned her hand, and we sat like that until the lamp needed oil and neither of us moved to fill it. I stood in the kitchen with Thomas's sleeping weight somewhere behind me and Ida's drawing on the table, and the spring dark outside the windows and Clara's hand in mine, and I thought, yes, this is what the adding is for. This is what it amounts to in the end. A good woman who looked at you when you were a man with a complicated past and a thin operation and too many winters alone and said, "I see you," and meant it, and who in the spring of the next year on a clear April morning was still saying it. The road between here and the 20 acres on Abilene Creek was 30 miles. I knew every bend of it now. Cicero was at the rail, patient as always, and in June the grass would be up and the days would be long and the whole plain would be alive with it, and I was going to ride south tomorrow and work through May and come back in June and see what came next. That was enough. More than enough. That was a man's whole life right there.